Okay, now we're going to look at section 2 of chapter 4. Uh, section 2 looks at guaranteeing other rights. So the rights we're going to look at is how did the 13th and 14th Amendments extend civil rights? Which amendments extended America's voting rights? Let me double check. I guess those are the only two objectives we have, so moving right on. Section 2, guaranteeing other rights, civil rights. First of all, um, civil rights are rights that are guaranteed to all U.S. citizens. Okay, rights that are guaranteed to all U.S. citizens. So, obviously we've skipped over the 11th and 12th Amendment, but the 13th Amendment, you can see that it occurred in 1865 and it outlawed slavery in the United States. Of course, some will say that this is what really caused the Civil War to happen, even though the Civil War actually um, was fought from 1861 to 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation is what really officially ended slavery. But the 13th Amendment outlawed it, making it illegal. Well, okay, now slavery is no longer legal in the United States, but what you have to realize is there are literally millions of former slaves now. They're former slaves. Well, if they're no longer slaves, what exactly is their status here in the United States? Um, what are they, how are they categorized? So you can see then that in 1868, the 14th Amendment granted full citizenship to African Americans in 1868. So now all of these individuals, African Americans, that are in the United States, especially those that were once slaves, are now citizens of this country. But you see, when our government created the 14th Amendment, they knew that especially the states in the South were not going to go along with this. That they were, I mean, after all, there were states in the South that seceded from the Union and fought against the government of this country so they could become their own nation, specifically so they could maintain slavery. Now, you think all of a sudden these states are going to go, "Oh yes, you defeated us in the Civil War, and now you're going to make these citizens that were once slaves, or these individuals that were once slaves, now you're going to make them citizens." So, oh, of course, we're going to jump right on board with that. In fact, we're going to treat them just like we would anyone else. No, they're not going to do that at all. And so, what the government did is they said that not only are we going to make them citizens, we're going to protect them against unfair actions by state governments. And the key word there is state governments. It doesn't say by the federal government, by state government. Now, this is in 1868. It's going to take almost another 100 years before Congress is going to put into place other forms of legislation that are going to help African Americans in this country. Almost another 100 years. And so really what African Americans in this country have had to endure is just, it's to be honest, it's actually it's pretty sad. And and why was it all even created in the first place? Money. That's what it was all based upon, because it all had to do with, we've got to raise enough cotton, we've got to raise enough tobacco. But heaven forbid if the people that are actually owning the land are having to go out there and do the work. No, let's bring these people in. Now, granted, this was a concept that wasn't brand new to the United States. Slavery had gone on over in Europe before, but by the time slavery started in the United States, slavery in Europe was gone. Um, that's one thing. The United States has always kind of been lacking behind Europe in a lot of areas, and unfortunately, this is one such area where we were lacking behind them a little bit. Okay, the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment in 1870. Well, it's 1868. We're going to make all African Americans citizens of the United States. Well, at this time, men in the United States had the right to vote. Well, these new African American men, they're going to be given the right to vote as well. And notice, it's African American men. It doesn't say the right given to African Americans. They are specific. And it's men because white women in the United States were not given the right to vote. And early on, voting was based upon ownership of land. And of course, men owned the large majority of land in the United States. So this was staying, I guess, consistent with that. Now, sticking along the lines of voting rights, this isn't who can vote necessarily, but who's going to be voted for. In 1913, we have the 17th Amendment. Now, what happened was, before the 17th Amendment came to be, you had state senators. State senators. Every state will send two representatives from their state to serve in the Senate. But what was happening was, instead of the people electing who these senators were going to be, the state legislature was choosing who these senators were going to be. Well, let's say that you have a person, and it's a goal of theirs to become a U.S. senator. This person just happens to have a good friend that is a high-ranking individual in the state legislature. So they strike up a deal. Okay, how about you nominate me as one of the next senators from our state? So, because this individual is thought highly of within the state legislature, they're going to go ahead and they're going to nominate that individual. Others really don't know much about this person, but they're thinking, well, if they're being nominated by this state legislator, then they must be a good person for the job. And so next thing you know, you have people that are becoming state senators, and they really have very few, if any, qualifications to hold that position. And so finally, citizens of states said, if these individuals are representing our state in Washington, shouldn't the people be choosing who they are instead of this small group of individuals at the state capitol? And Congress agreed with that, and they said, yeah, it should be the citizens. After all, we are a democratic society, and people are determining, who their leaders are going to be. In 1920, women were given the right to vote. Now, this is the 19th Amendment, but really the 18th Amendment is what really prompted women to be given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. The 18th Amendment made alcohol illegal in the United States, and women played a very pivotal role in getting the 18th Amendment passed. In fact, they played such a pivotal role that after the 18th Amendment was passed, women said, okay, this is what we needed, because now we can go to Congress and we can say, look at the role we played in getting the 18th Amendment passed. If it wasn't for women, the 18th Amendment may not have passed. But it passed because of us, which means the government knows that women have great influence. And if we can influence our federal government enough to where they're going to pass the 18th Amendment, then by golly, we should be given the right to vote. We have what it takes to be able to make good decisions when it comes to choosing who our leaders are going to be.
The voting amendments. Originally, only white males over the age of 21 were allowed to vote. But that all changed in 1870 with the passing of the 15th Amendment. It gave the right to all males over the age of 21, regardless of race, the right to vote. And then again in 1920, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, it gave all citizens over the age of 21 the right to vote regardless of sex. And finally, in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed. It gave the voting right to all citizens 18 years of age or older.
Okay, 1961, the 23rd Amendment gave citizens of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for president and vice president. See, Washington, D.C. is not located in a state. It is the District of Columbia. And the reason for that is because it was felt that if Washington, D.C. was placed in a state, then that state would probably have a lot of influence. And so they said, we're just gonna make the District of Columbia. And so problem though was that only states were the only ones who were voting for president and vice president. And here you have our nation's capital, people that live in our nation's capital where our president works, and yet they don't even get to have a vote. So 1961 gave the citizens of Washington, D.C. the right to vote. In 1964, it made poll taxes illegal. This is something we'll talk more about later on. And then in 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. The reason why this was so significant is that in 1971, the United States was involved in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, millions of men were getting drafted into the military. Well, in order to get drafted in the military, you had to be 18 years of age. But see, it seemed weird that at the age of 18, you're old enough to pick up a gun and go fight 12,000 miles away from where you live in a war that not a lot of people totally were behind, and that even you yourself were probably going to be confused as to exactly why the war was being fought. But yet, when it came to vote and to choose who our leaders are going to be, the federal government said, we just don't think you're responsible enough to be able to do that. But here's a gun, go die for your country. And so finally it was just said that if you're old enough to be able to be qualified to serve in our military and potentially die serving in our military, representing our country, then you should be old enough, you should be responsible enough to be able to walk into a voting booth and choose who our next leaders are going to be. And this brings to an end Section 2.